WashingTECH.
The Global South Scholarship tends to focus on data and digital technologies as experiences, as opposed to Global North Scholarship, which tends to focus on data and digital technologies as tools.
Welcome to Tech Policy.
From Washington, D.C., this is Tech Policy
with Joe Miller.
Joe Miller, founder and CEO of WashingTECH.
My guests today are Emnet Tafesse, research analyst at Data and Society on the AI on the Ground initiative. She has a passion for utilizing advocacy, research, and policy to create positive social change. She received her master's in public policy from University of Chicago and her BA in political science from Howard University. Ranjit Singh has a doctorate in science and technology studies from Cornell, and his research lies at the intersection of data infrastructures, global development, and public policy. Emnet Tafesse and Ranjit Singh. Data and Society, of course, has been around for a while. So could you tell us a bit about that? Tell us a bit about Data and Societies. Emnet, we can start with you. Tell us about Data and Society and the AI on the Ground initiative.
Yeah, Data and Society studies the social implications of data-centric technologies and automation. We've published work on the impacts of technology in labor, health, and disinformation. The AI on the Grounds initiative specifically looks at the impacts of AI systems on society and their governance.
Ranjit, tell us about the project you're working on and Data and Society and the digital welfare state.
Yeah, of course. Data and Society was one of the places that I was particularly interested in joining, primarily because it's been one of the places that has consistently produced really good research on the impact of data on our everyday lives. And I was particularly interested in the same issue. My deeper interest in the digital welfare state is a long one. I've been researching the implementation of India's biometric-based national identification infrastructure, Aadhaar, which means foundation in English, for almost 10 years now. My dissertation research at Cornell was on the challenges of implementing this infrastructure and the emerging changes in the nature of Indian citizenship as this biometric number increasingly became central to the organization of state services, including welfare. I examined everyday struggles of people in claiming welfare in India through the lens of thinking about the relationship between the everyday life of a person and how it is represented through data. The core insight from my work at the time was that to be seen as citizens, people must fall within core data categories of organizing state services. When their data is not available, miscategorized, or placed in residual categories, they become harder to see. So now I carried this interest when I joined Data and Society, and I started a project on mapping the conceptual vocabulary of data-driven AI-based interventions in what at the time I was calling the Global South.
And so when you talk about the Global South, which countries are you referring to for folks who aren't aware of the distinction between the Global South and the Global North?
Absolutely. I can talk a little bit about that. So let me start by saying that Global South and North distinction has always been a fluid one. Most of the scholarship on the Global South tends to basically come to the point of agreement on the idea that the Global South is everywhere, but always also somewhere. It highlights the asymmetry and inequality in the middle of intensifying global interdependency. So the various older ways of talking about Global South are the developing world or the third world. Over the course of the research that I've been doing for the past couple of years, I've come to believe that majority world is a better articulation of places, countries, or regions that are imagined to make up the Global South, because the majority of the world's population lives in these regions. The term was coined by Shahidul Alam, who is a photographer, writer, curator, and activist from Bangladesh, as a way to talk about populations that are rendered and remaindered as passive peripheries of ostensibly global problems and developments, generally emanating out of North America and Europe.
So Emnet, let's turn to you, talk a little bit about your background and your post and your dad's experiences in Ethiopia. Tell us about how your dad's heritage as a native Ethiopian and you as being a first generation American Tell me how that's shaped your perspective on how the digital world affects some of the things that Ranjit just described. Things related to your sense of belonging, your sense of safety, and your sense of personhood.
Yeah. My I was born and raised in Seattle. My parents are both from Ethiopia. My dad was an asylum seeker. He was part of the socialist group, Ethiopian People's Republic Party. So I grew up learning a lot about justice, freedom. Our dinner conversations were never casual. They were always like very heated and super dynamic and really concerned with like the well-being of our country. And I definitely have learned a lot being first generation Ethiopian in America, going back to Ethiopia and being perceived in different ways. Like I'm often when I'm home being asked about, where my parents grew up, what religion I am, as a way to kind of understand what tribe I am. And in my piece, I spoke a lot about where kind of this categorization. Ethiopia doesn't necessarily have this digital ID system that happens in some countries, but there is this kind of categorization that's happening, which affects a belonging. So I talked about my father's experience going home to Ethiopia for the first time and getting his Ethiopian ID, and talking to a government official and him asking what tribe he is, and my father being incredibly defiant, saying, "I'm Ethiopian." Never really like saying what tribe he was, but the official being able to discern his tribe by where he lives and what his name was, and just writing it on his ID and giving it back to him. And so I think that's kind of what the Digital Warfare series kinds of talks about, is the push and pull of digitization, where it can be something that can create systems that are helpful and allow for access to resources, but it also can be something that is concerning and can cause, issues with surveillance or marginalization, or a lot of opportunities for harms to come about that are felt by communities. And I think as a first generation Ethiopian going back and forth, I definitely felt that and spoke a bit about that in my piece.
And now you're based in New York. And I got to tell you, when I started out in my career, I remember my first job at this radio station in New York. Somebody there said, "Welcome to New York." I was like, "Yeah, so I'm from here." So, not the same kind of challenges your dad faced as an asylum seeker, but that sense of being home and people saying like, it's like, "No, I'm from here, so thank you." But Ranjit, in your posts, I've seen you talk about your expertise in bringing more equity to tech-related public policy discussions about the global South and some of the disparities and inequities that you see when you compare how those conversations differ from the ways in which, and the biases associated with discussing tech policy from the perspective of the global North kind of shapes that. Tell us about which countries you're seeing the most disparities happening between, and what you think we need to be more aware of or concerned about if we're trying to create a better world.
Absolutely. I think there's a starting point here where we have to begin by basically two core assumptions. First is that the developments in the majority world need to be addressed in their own right, instead of treating them as peripheries of developments that are happening in Europe and in North America. Second is that, the majority world and the countries in Latin America, Africa, South Asia are not just an empirical site of experimentation, but also a method to analyze what would it look like to actually imagine different kinds of outcomes from digital technologies and their appropriation. So if you look at the scholarship that is emerging from these areas and regions, you would see that there's a lot of concern among Global South researchers, which is kind of focused on concepts such as data extractivism, data colonialism, solidarity, data sovereignty, data justice. And all of these concepts are fundamentally very different from the keywords and ideas that come up in scholarship within America and Europe, which is kind of focused on bias, fairness, accountability, transparency, explainability, and responsibility. So the fundamental key difference between these two approaches is that, and this is a broad generalization, so it's not really true for every kind of scholarship, but the point here that I'm trying to make is that Global South scholarship tends to focus on data and digital technologies as experiences, as opposed to Global North scholarship, which tends to focus on data and digital technologies as tools. And there's a difference in the way in which we think about and work out what that large categorized difference kind of looks like in the context of how we think about technology policy. So, for example, when we think about digital technologies as tools, we focus on things like GDPR, explainability of technical interventions, transparency, stuff like that. But when we think about them as experiences, we have to consider what it means for a digital technology to replace an existing process of claiming any service. So people who struggle with this transition often need, to some extent, a sort of backward compatibility of bureaucratic procedures, where existing ways of doing things coexist with new ways of doing things at least for a certain amount of time, so that people actually get the time to transition from one way of doing things to another. This is a core challenge of how people experienced the struggle of claiming welfare whenever digital technologies have been appropriated in using and delivering welfare to any set of beneficiaries. So in this sense, grievance redressal, bug reporting, these are not afterthoughts. These are rather core concerns in implementing data-driven interventions in the Global South. And so we should start thinking about what these, thinking about digital technologies as experiences and what kind of consequences they have for the kinds of policies that we want to build into appropriation of these technologies.
And so how does this play out when it comes to misinformation and disinformation? What are some issues around disinformation and propaganda in India that are similar to the ones happening in the US, where we can kind of bridge the dialogue and leverage similarities so that we can, to some extent, have a more predictable way of managing the accuracy and credibility of the things that people are seeing online and in the media?
I think some of these issues are the same. So, for example, misinformation around COVID was prevalent everywhere in the world. It's not just a United States problem. It's a problem that has happened everywhere in the world, and people have tried to deal with it differently. But some of these problems are different from each other. So, for example, there's a lot more focus of social media companies on content moderation in the United States and in Europe, as compared to, for example, content moderation in Burma, or Myanmar, or any of these other countries where Facebook has tried to implement its free basics platforms without actually giving people enough information and enough ability to actually seek out the content that is beyond what is free and freely available on the platform itself, which basically makes it a lot more difficult for people to discern and differentiate between what is misinformation from a headline as opposed to what is real information. And this has been one of the core challenges that kind of came about in the study of why Rohingya refugees had to deal with so many problems as they were trying to basically make their way out of Myanmar, and the kind of misinformation that was spreading around about them. So some of these challenges are clearly similar, but at the same time, we have to focus and think about the difference in the investments that social media companies make on content moderation across countries, primarily because, there's one, of course, the problem of language, where, content that is in English is seemingly easier to moderate, given that there is a lot more content on the internet on English. But at the same time, as soon as we kind of move into other languages, it becomes difficult to actually codify it using natural language processing in itself, which basically means that it requires more human moderators, which basically also means that you're constantly needing to apply more resources in order to actually do that kind of and sort of moderation, which has been a challenge and which is rarely focused upon by tech companies in general. And I think that is where the similarity and the difference lies in terms of thinking about what sort of misinformation is happening in the world. While some of them have similar contexts, others don't. And when they're not the same, it kind of creates its own set of challenges.
Policy is global policy. This is the WashingTECH Tech Policy Podcast, serving the world.
Emnet, what are your thoughts on misinformation and disinformation and how it affects the international dialogue?
Yeah, I think growing up, my family is always very politicized. We always had, Pal Talk on, so many live streams on Facebook from Ethiopia, so many things that, I found my family being highly polarized, tribally. And part of that is due, and most of my family are not even on the continent at this, on my mom's side. And being completely removed from the continent are still experiencing a lot of misinformation and disinformation, and not having that ability to be on the ground and having these conversations, but just having it over the like Facebook threads and Twitter can be really problematic. It's hard. It's been hard to watch over the last 10 years, watching everyone become so polarized. And yeah, I think it's a huge problem, and it's definitely led to a lot of struggles in Ethiopia because the diaspora has so much power. A lot of the people who left Ethiopia when my parents left were either the ousted bourgeoisie or the rebels. And so they are of that generation, are highly politicized, and being in America are also highly polarized because of that connection, but also that disconnection through social media. And you don't see that media literacy in the same way that I have it. I can walk into the living room of my father's house and be that live stream, they're saying some spicy things, that YouTube live stream. And I wouldn't take all of those things to heart because I was at my cousin's house and it was a different live stream saying the exact opposite things. Or I'll be in Ethiopia and I'll be at an incident or an uprising. I'll be there on the grounds. And then I come home and the conversation of how things happened on the grounds is totally different. The understanding how things played out are totally different because people are seeing it through the media, through social media posts. It's no, I was there. I saw the flags being ripped off. That's not what happened. And so it's definitely a challenging thing, especially when people are connected and not so connected, even within the nation. There are parts that are super, Addis Abeba's, the capital, and there's internet, there's a little bit of people have smartphones, but they necessarily won't know what's happening on the outskirts of the country. But all they will have is the social media content, and folks on the outskirts of the country might not have access to smartphones and internet and
then you have everything that's going on here.
Yeah.
Wow. I can't imagine trying to process that and what you're experiencing as a Black woman in the United States, and Ranjit, what you're experiencing as an Indian man in the United States. Tell us a little bit about about how you process in light of your scholarship and your life experience?
I think it's similar. In some ways, I think there's like a human element of like in Ethiopia where people, hate each other that are brothers and sisters. I can't tell the difference between tribes. Some people can, but I can't when I'm there. And I think it has always made me think about care and love and like, how do we move past so much hate and polarization? And I used to think that only in the American context, how do we move forward? How do we like change systems and communities? But as I've, grown up and understand the politics of Ethiopia, understand it's similar in some ways. Like the base issue is like, how do we connect? How do we move forward? How do we love and care and create communities? And I think that's like a key. I still don't always have the answers to that question. I think in America, it's a little like easier because I'm like, there's like really clear actions we can do because of the history of like enslavement, and they're like clear wrongs. But definitely Ethiopia, it's kind of, for me as a diaspora and someone who grew up in the States, it's much more challenging.
I can completely understand and identify with what Emnet just said, because part of the challenge is that you can see these differences even in your own country in one way or the other. There's a sort of a polarization that's basically taken over the entire world. And, when I initially heard your question, I was kind of thinking more about it in terms of being away from home. I haven't been to India in the last 2 years. I was trying to go in March, but the war between Russia and Ukraine kind of made it. So my flight to India got canceled, and my mom was extremely disappointed that I couldn't make it home to visit for a bit. But at the same time, part of the learning and part of the way in which I've kind of understood my experience, a part of what I've understood is that it's always difficult to actually first get a sense of where you're at in terms of a place. I've lived in Netherlands, I've lived in the US, and every single time it takes a while to get used to being in a new place, understanding its culture. One of the first things that I realized about the United States is that you get a lot of food to eat. And you get a lot of, take home food if you're basically eating at a restaurant, which is great. But at the same time, it's also very different in terms of your expectations. And, just the ice cream cone that you get here is just massive and phenomenal. So the point that I'm trying to make is that it's not just about how we see the various differences that are happening culturally, but also how personally we experience them. And sometimes they're really small things that we experience and kind of remember. And at other times we kind of see these big things and kind of worry about them. So for example, the way in which the United States deals with the issue of Second Amendment is very different from the way in which India deals with the issue of guns. And that's a part of recognizing that difference and coming to terms with it. And that's a part of life.
A lot to think about here, and thank you both for joining me. What are some final ideas you'd like to leave with us before we close, and where can we find you online?
I would like to folks to this, knowing that, while technology and digitization can really offer some amazing systems, that it's really important for us to continue to take steps back to understand harms and the harms being felt by communities, and that voices of communities need to be centered in the conversations around the implementation of systems and technology. I just joined Twitter at Emnet Speaks.
Just quickly adding to it, I think the only thing that I would say is that when we think about the ways in which technology is impacting our lives, especially in the context of digital technologies, we there is a way by which we tend to think about these technologies as being more efficient, being more inclusive. And if you kind of look at what's really happening on the ground, what they do is to make and produce difference. It's not like they're not efficient. They're efficient for some people at the expense of others. So understanding that difference is an important part of thinking about technological implementation. Focusing on that difference and how to actually tackle that difference would actually make for better policy, because continuously accounting for how do we actually manage that difference and what do we do for people for whom these technological interventions don't work is an important part of thinking about technological implementation in the first place. So it's not just about implementing something to basically make a service efficient. It's simultaneously about what does it mean to actually implement the service and what do we do for people for whom we know and over time we will see that this technology doesn't work. And how do we actually think about that? And we'll be working and basically producing more content as well as producing research reports on AI in and from the majority world over the next 6 months. And I hope that, you will be able to look at it by just following the Data and Society's newsletter.
Ranjit Singh, a postdoctoral fellow, and Emnet Tafesse, research analyst, both of whom are with Data and Society's AI on the Ground initiative. Thanks to you both.
Thank you so much for having us. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
WashingTECH.